The boy had never seen a nation tear itself apart before. He stood barefoot at the edge of the dirt road, the red clay warm beneath his feet, watching the column of men march past his father's farm. Their boots struck the earth in uneven rhythm, some confident, some hesitant, many already worn thin before they had even reached their first battlefield. Rifles rested on shoulders like awkward extensions of bone. Flags fluttered overhead, heavy with meaning that most of these men could not yet fully understand. It was the spring of 1861, and America was learning how to bleed. No one called it a civil war then, not out loud, not with certainty. In newspapers and taverns, in churches and parlors, people used softer words: crisis, secession, misunderstanding. But the land itself seemed to know better. The fields, the rivers, the railroads, everything that had once connected the states now felt like fault lines. The boy's name was Samuel Carter, and he was 12 years old when Fort Sumter fell. He did not hear the cannons himself. South Carolina was far from his family's small farm in western Virginia, but the news arrived like thunder carried by the wind. A rider came first, then a newspaper days later, its ink smudged by too many hands. Men gathered around it as if it were a living thing. Women listened from doorways. Children learned to stay quiet. War, the adults said, had finally chosen them. Samuel watched his father that night, sitting by the fireplace with the paper folded carefully on his knee. Thomas Carter was not a man of many words. His hands were thick and scarred, shaped by years of working soil that did not always reward effort. He had voted for Lincoln, quietly, without enthusiasm. He believed the Union mattered. He also believed that nothing good came from forcing men to change faster than their hearts could bear. Now those beliefs were colliding. "They'll call for volunteers," Thomas said at last, staring into the fire. "North and South both." Samuel's mother, Eleanor, did not look up from her sewing. Her needle moved steadily, as if the future could be held together with careful stitches. "And what will you do?" she asked. Thomas did not answer immediately. Outside, the spring insects sang as they always had, indifferent to flags and borders. Samuel felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation he did not yet have words for. "I'll do what I must," his father finally said. Across the country, thousands of men were saying the same thing, and none of them meant exactly the same thing by it. In Washington, the air was thick with anxiety and resolve. Abraham Lincoln, newly inaugurated, sat at his desk long into the night, reading dispatches that confirmed what he already knew. The Union was fracturing, not because of a single election or a single speech, but because of a wound that had been festering since the nation's birth: slavery. The word hovered over every conversation like a ghost people pretended not to see. For decades, Americans had argued over it, compromised around it, and profited from it. Entire economies had grown fat on the labor of men and women who were denied even the most basic recognition of their humanity. Entire moral systems had been built to justify it. Now the justifications were failing. 7 states had already seceded before Lincoln took office. More would follow. Each believed it was defending something sacred: sovereignty, tradition, honor, survival. The North believed it was defending the Union itself, the idea that a nation founded on law could not simply be torn apart by disagreement. Both sides believed God was watching. Back in Virginia, Samuel's world grew smaller and louder at the same time. Drums echoed from towns he had never visited. Recruiting officers appeared, standing straight-backed and solemn, promising purpose and glory to men who had never left their counties. Virginia itself hesitated, balanced between worlds. It was a slave state, but many of its people felt closer to the Union than to the Deep South. That tension ran through communities like a crack in ice. When Virginia finally seceded, the crack became a break. Thomas Carter did not celebrate. He stood in the barn, sharpening a blade that did not need sharpening, while Samuel watched silently. "You don't have to go," Samuel said, his voice smaller than he wanted it to be. Thomas looked at his son then, really looked at him, as if trying to memorize his face. "If I don't, someone else's father will." It was not an answer that brought comfort, but it was an honest one. Training camps sprang up almost overnight. Men who had plowed fields and run shops now learned to load muskets, how to march, how to stand still while someone shouted at them until standing still felt harder than running. Samuel accompanied his father part of the way to camp, walking beside the wagon until the road forked and soldiers took over. There were no speeches between them, no dramatic promises, just a long silence, broken only when Thomas knelt and placed his hands on Samuel's shoulders. "Take care of your mother," he said. Samuel nodded. He wanted to say 100 things. None of them would come. As the wagon rolled away, Samuel felt the world tilt, not suddenly, but permanently. The first major battles of the war were chaotic, clumsy, and horrifying. At Bull Run, men picnicked on hillsides to watch what they thought would be a brief engagement. They went home running for their lives. The war did not resemble the paintings or the speeches. It smelled of fear and blood and confusion. Thomas Carter survived his first battle. Many did not. Letters came home, folded and unfolded until the creases softened. Thomas wrote about the weather, about missing Eleanor's bread, about Samuel's dog. He did not write about the dead. Samuel began working the farm in earnest, his hands blistering as his father's once had. He learned quickly that war did not only live on battlefields. It lived in empty chairs, in unpaid debts, in the way his mother sometimes stared at the road long after sunset. As months turned into years, the war transformed. What had begun as a fight to preserve the Union became something larger and more dangerous. The Emancipation Proclamation would change the moral center of the conflict, but it would not simplify it. Freedom, long denied, did not arrive gently. It came through fire and resistance and sacrifice. Enslaved people fled plantations, crossed battle lines, and forced the nation to confront the human cost of its compromises. Some joined the Union Army, wearing blue uniforms that did not protect them from discrimination, but they did give them a weapon and a voice. The war was no longer just about states. It was about the meaning of America itself. In the winter of 1862, Samuel received a letter written in a hand he barely recognized. His father's script had grown shaky. "I don't know how this ends, but I know now that it cannot end the way it began." Samuel read the line again and again, sensing that his father had crossed an invisible line, one that many men crossed too late, and some never crossed at all. Outside, snow fell softly on the fields, covering scars that would reappear in the spring. The nation was learning, slowly and painfully, that some wounds must be cut open before they can heal. And the worst was yet to come.
By the summer of 1862, the war had shed its innocence. What little illusion remained after Bull Run was burned away in places with names that would soon be etched into the American memory. Shiloh, Antietam, Seven Pines. These were not distant points on a map anymore. They were wounds. And like all wounds, they demanded blood before they closed. Thomas Carter learned this on a muddy field near the Tennessee River. Shiloh began before dawn, When most of the Union soldiers were still half asleep, their rifles stacked neatly beside tents that offered no protection at all. The Confederate attack came like a storm breaking through fog, sudden, deafening, and unstoppable. Men ran barefoot, grabbing weapons as cannon fire tore through canvas and flesh alike. Thomas had been awake. He had learned in these past months that survival often depended on small habits, waking early, keeping boots close, never trusting silence. Even so, nothing prepared him for the sound of men screaming as they died. The ground became slick beneath his feet. Smoke choked the air until the sun itself seemed wounded, filtered through gray like a failing eye. Orders were shouted, contradicted, lost entirely. The battle dissolved into chaos, regiments colliding, retreating, advancing again with no clear sense of victory or defeat. At one point, Thomas found himself kneeling beside a boy who could not have been older than Samuel. The boy clutched his stomach, blood seeping through his fingers, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't want to die," the boy said. Thomas had no answer that mattered. Shiloh lasted 2 days. When it ended, more than 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. It shocked the nation not because it was unique, but because it was a warning. This war would not be short. Back home, Samuel read about Shiloh in the newspapers, though the words felt thin compared to the truth he sensed behind them. He scanned casualty lists obsessively, tracing columns of names with a trembling finger. When he did not find his father's name, relief came mixed with guilt, an emotion he was learning to recognize all too well. Eleanor Carter prayed more often now, not loudly, not dramatically, just small whispered prayers while kneading dough or folding clothes. She prayed not only for Thomas, but for the version of her son that was slipping away. Samuel was 14 now, taller, leaner, his childhood eroded by responsibility. He spoke less. He watched more. War had a way of accelerating time, of forcing boys toward manhood whether they were ready or not. Sometimes at night he dreamed of cannons firing from the hills beyond the farm. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln aged rapidly. His face, once merely lined, now seemed carved by grief. Each day brought new reports, victories that felt hollow, defeats that felt catastrophic. He walked the halls of the White House like a man carrying a weight no one else could lift. Lincoln understood something that many generals did not. The war could not be won by tactics alone. The South's ability to fight was tied directly to the institution of slavery. As long as millions of enslaved people labored behind Confederate lines, building fortifications, growing food, sustaining the economy, the rebellion would endure. The question was no longer whether slavery was wrong. The question was whether the nation was willing to destroy it. When Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862, following the blood-soaked stalemate at Antietam, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some hailed it as a moral awakening. Others condemned it as reckless, unconstitutional, or insufficient. For the enslaved, it was something else entirely. It was a signal. Across the South, enslaved men and women listened carefully to rumors carried by soldiers, by preachers, by the wind itself. Freedom had always been a dangerous word, spoken quietly, imagined boldly. Now it felt closer, still distant, still deadly, but closer than it had ever been. They ran. They walked through swamps, hid in forests, crossed rivers under moonlight. Some made it to Union lines, some were turned back, some were caught and punished with a brutality meant to serve as a warning. But warnings were losing their power.
When black men began wearing black Union rifles in their hands, the war changed shape again. The Union-colored troops faced discrimination, lower pay, and disproportionate danger. Confederate forces often refused to take them prisoner. Still, they fought. They fought not only for the Union, but for a future that had never been promised to them. Thomas Carter saw black soldiers for the first time outside Vicksburg. He had been transferred west as the Union focused on splitting the Confederacy along the Mississippi River. Vicksburg loomed above the river like a fortress carved from stone. Grant's campaign to take it was relentless. Marches through heat and disease, assaults that failed at terrible cost, a siege that strangled the city slowly. During one march, Thomas passed a regiment of black soldiers resting beside the road. Their uniforms were worn, their faces resolute. A white officer barked orders nearby, his tone sharp, impatient. One of the black soldiers met Thomas's eyes briefly, not with anger, not with fear, but with something like recognition. "We are both here," the look seemed to say, "and we both know why this matters." That night, Thomas wrote to Samuel. "There are men here fighting for a country that never fought for them," he wrote. "If that doesn't tell us what this war is becoming, I don't know what will." Vicksburg fell on July 4th, 1863. The Mississippi River belonged to the Union again. The Confederacy was split in two. The victory came one day after another battle, far to the east, reached its terrible conclusion. Gettysburg. Samuel was helping his mother mend a fence when the news arrived. A neighbor rode up, hat clutched tight, his horse lathered with sweat. "It's bad," the man said simply. For 3 days in July, the hills and fields around Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, had become the center of the war. Men fought hand to hand among rocks and wheat fields. Cannon fire shook the ground until it seemed the earth itself was trying to flee. Pickett's charge, launched on the 3rd day, sent thousands of Confederate soldiers across open ground into a storm of Union fire. It was courage stripped of strategy, valor sacrificed to desperation. When it was over, more than 50,000 men were casualties. The Confederacy would never fully recover. But victory did not feel like triumph. Thomas Carter was not at Gettysburg. He learned about it the way most soldiers did, through fragments of information passed along campfires, through letters that arrived weeks late, through the haunted expressions of men who had been there. That fall, he marched again, his body thinner, his eyes harder. The war had taught him to kill. It had not taught him to live with it. He began to notice how the land changed as the armies passed through. Farms stripped bare, towns hollowed out, civilians caught between sides, accused of loyalty to the wrong flag, punished for existing in the wrong place. This was no longer a gentleman's war. This was total war. In 1864, Ulysses S. Grant took command of all Union armies. He understood something simple and terrifying. The South could not replace its losses. If the Union applied constant pressure, no pauses, no retreats for the sake of appearances, the rebellion would collapse under its own weight. William Tecumseh Sherman took that logic and carried it through Georgia. As Sherman's army marched toward the sea, they destroyed railroads, factories, and crops. They freed enslaved people in vast numbers, even as they left devastation behind. Some called it barbarism, others called it necessary. For the people who lived in the path of the march, it was unforgettable. Samuel Carter, now 16, stood taller than his mother. He worked harder than most grown men, but war had found him anyway. One evening, a Union officer arrived at the farm with news. Thomas had been wounded.
Not mortally, the officer said quickly, but badly enough that he would not return to the front. Relief flooded Eleanor's face, followed immediately by fear. Wounded soldiers did not always come home whole. When Thomas finally returned months later, Samuel barely recognized him. He walked with a limp, his left hand trembling slightly when he tried to hold a cup. His eyes, though steady.
When the guns finally fell silent, America discovered that quiet could be more terrifying than noise. The soldiers came home in waves, some marching proudly, some limping, some carried by memories that refused to stay buried. The war had ended on paper, but it continued in bodies and minds. Fields were empty, towns scarred, families incomplete. Victory and defeat shared the same exhausted face. For Thomas Carter, peace arrived without ceremony. He returned to the farm with a discharge paper folded neatly in his coat pocket and a pain in his leg that flared whenever the weather changed. The farm looked smaller than he remembered, as if the war had stretched him beyond it. Samuel, now nearly 18, worked the land with a strength that startled his father. They did not speak about the war, not because it was forbidden, but because it did not yet have a shape that words could hold. In Washington, the promise of a new birth of freedom hovered over the Capitol like unfinished music. Reconstruction began not as a single plan, but as a collision of hopes and fears. Radical Republicans pushed for full citizenship and voting rights for formerly enslaved people. Southern whites, many of whom had lost everything except their belief in racial hierarchy, resisted with bitterness and violence. Northern resolve wavered as the costs, political, economic, emotional, mounted. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th promised equal protection under the law. The 15th aimed to secure voting rights regardless of race. On paper, the nation transformed itself. On the ground, the transformation was contested inch by inch. Samuel Carter saw the change firsthand. In 1866, he left the farm for the first time with intention, not necessity. Reconstruction had brought Union officials, teachers, and Freedmen's Bureau agents into regions that had once been isolated. Samuel found work as a clerk in a nearby town, drawn by the sense that history was still unfolding and that he did not want to watch it from the sidelines. He met Elijah Freeman there. Elijah had been born enslaved on a plantation in eastern Virginia. He was older than Samuel by 10 years, though his posture carried a weariness that suggested a much longer life. He could read, barely, having learned in secret at great risk. When the war ended, he chose his last name deliberately. Freeman, he said, with a quiet pride that needed no explanation. The two men worked in the same office, recording land claims, labor contracts, and complaints. Samuel listened more than he spoke. Elijah had stories of family sold away, of nights spent planning escape routes that were never used, of freedom arriving not as joy, but as a responsibility heavy enough to bend the spine. "I'm free now," Elijah once said. But freedom don't tell you where to go, it just opens the door. Violence followed the opening of that door. White supremacist groups formed in the shadows, their names whispered before they were spoken aloud. They wore hoods and rode at night, enforcing an order that the war had failed to kill. Lynchings, beatings, and intimidation became tools of political control. Samuel watched as black men registered to vote under the protection of federal troops. He also watched as that protection thinned with each passing year. The North was growing tired. The South was growing organized. Thomas Carter understood less of the politics, but he understood fear. He saw it in Elijah's eyes when rumors spread of night riders. He saw it in Eleanor's face when Samuel came home late. He felt it in his own chest when he realized that the war had taught men how to kill and had sent them home without teaching them how to stop. One evening, Samuel returned home with a split lip and a bruise forming beneath his eye. "They didn't like what I was writing down," he said simply. Thomas said nothing. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm and unshaking. Later that night, he sat alone on the porch, staring into darkness that felt increasingly crowded. Reconstruction faltered not because it was impossible, but because it demanded endurance. Economic panic in 1873 shifted priorities. Federal troops were withdrawn from southern states in exchange for political compromise. The rights that had been promised were left unguarded. Jim Crow laws rose quietly, efficiently, designed not to enslave again outright, but to constrain life until freedom felt theoretical. Elijah Freeman lost his job when the office closed. He stayed in town, working odd jobs, voting when he could, keeping his head down when he had to. Samuel watched the light in his friend's eyes dim, not vanish, but retreat. "We fought the law," Elijah said, not bitterly, just tired. "Now we fight memory." Samuel married in 1875. Her name was Margaret Hill, a schoolteacher who believed stubbornly in progress. She taught black and white children alike, ignoring warnings that it was unwise. Samuel loved her for that defiance, even when it frightened him. They built a life carefully, one decision at a time. Thomas lived long enough to see his grandson born. He held the child with hands that had once carried a rifle, his grip surprisingly gentle. He did not speak of the future, but his eyes lingered on the baby's face as if searching for something, perhaps proof that the suffering had purchased something worth keeping. Thomas Carter died quietly one winter morning, the war finally loosening his grip on him. By the turn of the century, the Civil War had already begun to harden into legend. Monuments rose, selective and silent about what they truly commemorated. Veterans marched in parades, their uniforms cleaned of blood by time. Textbooks softened language, avoided causes, favored reconciliation over truth. Samuel, now an older man, read these accounts with a mixture of pride and unease. The war had preserved the Union, but the peace had compromised its promise. One evening, Samuel found Elijah sitting on a bench near the courthouse, staring at a statue recently erected in the square. "Looks like they're remembering it wrong," Elijah said. Samuel sat beside him. "They always do," Samuel replied. Elijah nodded. "Then it's up to us to remember it right." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that blurred the statue's edges. For a moment, the past and present overlapped, war and peace, freedom and fear, memory and truth. Samuel understood then that history was not something finished, it was something carried, and the weight of it, like the weight of freedom, belonged to every generation that followed.
Time did what war could not. It softened the sharpest edges, dulled the loudest memories, and wrapped the past in layers of routine until it felt manageable. But beneath that surface, the Civil War continued to pulse, quietly, persistently, through American life. Samuel Carter grew old in a country that insisted it had moved on. He watched the 19th century give way to the 20th, watched railroads stretch farther than imagination once allowed, watched cities rise where forests had stood. The nation industrialized, mechanized, hurried forward as if speed itself could outrun memory. Yet the arguments never truly disappeared. They merely learned new words. Samuel's son, Thomas Jr., came of age in a world shaped by consequences rather than choices. He learned about the Civil War in school as a tragedy of brother against brother, a noble conflict resolved by courage and compromise. Slavery was mentioned, but briefly, as if it were an unfortunate detail rather than the engine that had driven everything else. At the dinner table, Samuel corrected him gently. It was about people, he said, about who counted. Thomas Jr. listened, but impatience flickered in his eyes. He lived in a generation that wanted clarity, not complication. He believed the future could be engineered cleanly, without the mess of old sins. Samuel recognized the impulse. He had once felt it himself. In the South, segregation hardened into law. Separate but equal became the nation's most dangerous lie, sanctified by courts and enforced by custom. Black citizens navigated a landscape filled with invisible boundaries, their movements constrained by signs, glances, and unspoken rules that carried real consequences. Elijah Freeman lived long enough to see these rules formalized. "They wrote it down this time," he said, when news of the laws reached Samuel. "Makes it easier to pretend it's fair." Elijah died in 1904, quietly, without ceremony. Samuel attended the funeral, standing beside men and women who carried dignity like armor. As the coffin was lowered, Samuel felt the weight of an era slipping away. He wondered who would remember Elijah's full life, not just his survival, but his hope. America entered new wars. In 1898, then again in 1917, young men marched off under banners of patriotism, convinced they were fighting for freedom somewhere else. Samuel watched them with a familiarity that made his chest ache. The uniforms had changed, the speeches had not. Margaret died during the influenza pandemic of 1918. The loss hollowed Samuel in ways the war never had. He moved through his days carefully, like a man carrying something fragile and invisible. His grandson, James, became his anchor, a bright-eyed boy who asked questions without fear. "Did you fight in the war?" Samuel said. "No, but it fought in me." As Samuel aged, memory became less obedient. Faces returned without names, scenes replayed out of order. He found himself waking at night, certain he heard cannon fire, only to realize it was thunder rolling across distant hills. He began to write, not for publication, not for recognition, but for preservation. He wrote about his father leaving the farm, about Elijah choosing his name, about the promises that had been made and broken and made again in different forms. He wrote because forgetting felt like betrayal. By the time Samuel died in the early 1920s, the Civil War had receded into sepia-toned photographs and veterans' reunions where old men shook hands across former lines. Reconciliation had become the preferred narrative, a story of mutual valor and shared suffering. It was easier that way. The truth, Samuel knew, was harder. The war had ended slavery, but it had not ended inequality. It had preserved the Union, but it had not unified memory. It had answered one moral question decisively, while leaving many others unresolved. That was its legacy. James Carter carried those lessons forward, though he did not yet know it. He grew up during the Great Depression, watched neighbors lose farms and hope in equal measure. He served in another war, this one global, fighting fascism abroad while segregation endured at home. When he returned, older and quieter, he read his grandfather's notebooks. "This country keeps asking the same questions. It just changes who has to answer them," James said to his own son years later. By the middle of the 20th century, the unfinished work of Reconstruction reemerged with force. Black Americans demanded the rights promised generations earlier. They marched, they sat in, they were beaten and jailed and sometimes killed. The language of freedom resurfaced, sharpened with clarity and courage. Television carried images into living rooms across the nation, dogs and fire hoses, children walking past shouting crowds into newly integrated schools. America could no longer look away. In those moments, the Civil War stopped feeling distant. It felt immediate. The same arguments, the same fears, the same resistance to change, only now the battlefield was moral rather than physical. The weapons were laws, images, and persistence. Some monuments fell, some truths rose, others resisted, as stubborn as ever. The nation moved forward unevenly. Progress arrived in legislation and court rulings, then stalled in practice. Memory remained contested ground. Flags and statues became proxies for deeper disagreements about history, responsibility, and belonging. People argued not only about what happened, but about what it meant. And meaning, Samuel had understood long ago, was the real battlefield. The Civil War was no longer a war of cannons and muskets. It was a war of memory, of interpretation, of whether America would fully reckon with its past or continue to negotiate with it. The answer, as always, was incomplete.
Every nation tells itself stories. Some are heroic, some are comforting, some are necessary lies, told not to deceive others, but to survive oneself. America's story of the Civil War became all three. By the time James Carter reached old age, the war that had defined his grandfather's life had transformed into a symbol wielded in arguments that would have been unrecognizable to the men who fought it. Flags once carried into battle now appeared on bumper stickers and protest signs. Statues raised in one era were challenged in another. The past had not stayed in the past. It had followed the nation forward. James lived long enough to see the civil rights movement fracture the silence that had settled after Reconstruction. He watched as laws changed again, this time pushed by courage rather than compromise. He also watched as resistance adapted, trading open defiance for subtler forms of exclusion. "It never ends cleanly," James told his daughter, Anna. "History doesn't like clean endings." Anna believed him. She became a historian, not because she loved dates or documents, but because she was unsettled by how easily truth could be rearranged. In archives and libraries, she encountered the Civil War not as a single story, but as thousands of competing voices: soldiers, enslaved people, politicians, widows, children. She noticed what was missing. Silence, she learned, was an artifact, too. In the late 20th century, debates over Confederate symbols reignited with intensity. Some defended them as heritage, others condemned them as celebrations of oppression. The arguments were loud, emotional, and deeply personal. Anna thought often of Samuel's notebooks. He had not written to persuade, he had written to remember. That distinction mattered. America entered the 21st century carrying the same unresolved inheritance. Economic inequality mapped itself along old fault lines. Voting rights, secured, eroded, challenged, defended, remained a battleground. The language of unity returned whenever division felt dangerous, often without confronting its causes. After a racially motivated act of violence in a southern town, reporters stood in front of churches older than the Civil War itself, asking familiar questions. How did this happen? The answers were always there. They were just inconvenient. Anna visited the old Carter farm one autumn afternoon.
The house was gone now, replaced by a weathered foundation and a field reclaimed by tall grass. She stood where Samuel had once watched soldiers march past, imagining the sound of boots on earth that no longer remembered them. She brought one of the notebooks with her. Sitting on a fallen beam, she read passages aloud, not for an audience, but for the land. Words about a boy watching his father leave, about a man choosing the name Freeman, about freedom offered and delayed and demanded again. The Civil War, Anna understood, was not a closed chapter. It was a hinge. Everything before it bent toward everything after. The war had forced the nation to answer whether it would survive. It had not forced it to decide what survival meant. That question remained alive, shifting with each generation. America's strength had always been its capacity to change. Its weakness had been its reluctance to finish what it started. Reconstruction had promised transformation and delivered retreat. Civil rights had achieved legal victory and exposed cultural resistance. Each step forward revealed how far there was still to go. Progress was real. So was backlash. Both were part of the inheritance. As Anna left the field, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the grass. She thought of Samuel's final line, written in a hand weakened by age. The war taught us that freedom costs blood. History teaches us that it also costs honesty. That honesty, she knew, was still being negotiated. The American Civil War had ended in 1865, but its work, defining who belonged, whose lives mattered, and what justice required, had never truly stopped. The cannons fell silent. The questions